Video.
Hey, there we are. Yay.
Yay, we're all here. All right, everyone, welcome to this wonderful panel about death and funerary practices in science fiction. I am your friendly local moderator, Monica Louzon, and I have here with me two wonderful guests. Real quick before they do their introductions, just a quick reminder that Balticon is free, but it does have a GoFundMe to help fund expenses for paying for the technology and for funding all the awesome stuff that the Baltimore Science Fiction Society does during the year to make this possible and to help out the local community. So if you have some money to throw at a charity, please consider throwing some through the Baltimore GoFundMe, or there's also a PayPal if you prefer not to deal with the GoFundMe fees. So before I continue any further, let's go. Jeannie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jeanne Adams. I write science fiction, space adventure. I write urban fantasy. I write paranormal romantic suspense. And I spent 13 years in the funeral business and family cemetery business. And I write or I do a presentation on body disposal for writers. So I presume that's why I'm on the panel.
She must be so popular. Imagine that. My God, that is just so thrilling. My name's Brenda Clough, and I've been writing for a long time. I write science fiction and fantasy, but I got sucked into a series of Victorian thrillers, which are coming out one a month this year from Bookview Cafe. And the first one's free, so you can go over and you know, like drugs, the first one's free. And I know the reason why I'm in this panel, because for many years until I retired, I worked for the International Cemetery Cremation and Funeral Association, which is the trade group for the industry in the United States. And so like cemeteries, funeral homes, crematories. So between the two of us here, we know a lot about the industry. It's really kind of frightening, and I don't know what we're going to do about it.
And I volunteered to moderate this panel because I read a lot of National Geographic, and there's a lot of stuff about it, death and funerary practices around the world in National Geographic. And then also I have a background in colonial Latin American studies and Latin American history. And so I'm familiar with Andean burial practices, but I don't feel knowledgeable enough to volunteer to be a panelist. I was like, oh, I'd love to hear what these other experts have to say. So here we are. And I figured to start off, we should talk about why should writers care about death and funerary practices in their stories, and what happens to stories when writers include these things. And Brenda, you can go first, but I figure you can just bounce back and forth as you feel like.
Well, the reason, of course, that you want to think about if you're creating a world, the reason you want to think about funerary and death things is for the same reason you want to think about food, clothing, horses, weather. It's part of the world building. It is, at least for human beings, it's very unusual to have no funerary events at all, you know, just like drop the body into the dumpster and keep on going. That's very, very rare. Mostly people do stuff. And in fact, that's how they determine that you're getting close to being human. You know, Neanderthals buried things with their beloveds, you know, flowers and stuff. And when you discover this, then you say, they're not just animals. They're getting to human here. And so that's sort of how you do it. And since it's baked into us, your readers, you would wish to include that even in a quite alien culture that you're creating, because it gives them a connection to us, just like food, you know. It's you could write, I suppose, about a culture that doesn't do any of the things that are interesting to human beings, but then it starts to be hard to connect to your readers. You know, maybe people do not want to read about cultures like that.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that that you see even on our planet is a wide variety of cultural differences in the way funerary practices occur. I mean, some cultures burn their dead. Some cultures refuse to bury in anything that's not completely natural and will go back to the earth. Some cultures want to preserve the body against all damage and defamation, and that's only really been in the last 60 years. But so when you don't include that in a novel, you sort of leave out a rich treasure trove of things that you can do, as Brenda says, to connect your reader with your characters, especially in a science fiction setting, because if you're setting up a world where these are aliens and they are alien unto us, there has to be some meeting of common ground, right? So that's one way you as a writer can do it, is find some common ground in death practices or the fact that they do grieve the losses. And when writers include those things, it can be a really, really rich treasure trove of a shorthand way to understand a huge culture that you've created. So that's one good thing. Of course, it's also a bad thing if you go wrong.
Well, and if just even the act of leaving it out, it demonstrates the alienness of a culture. I wrote about a bunch of aliens once who were essentially, they're a slime mold. And when the human explorers arrived on the planet and they landed, and it was kind of squishy, and they didn't realize for some period of time that they're standing on about 20 feet of alien, and the life form just covers the planet 20 feet deep. And so when they finally got to someplace where there was an actual rock, it was, oh, this is so great. But you realize that with that kind of an alien, it's immortal, for one thing. It's never going to worry about dying. And since it is immortal and doesn't worry about dying, there is no issue of lots of the things that interest us: food, burial, clothing. Large numbers of things are irrelevant, and that increase the alienness of it. So it is, and the number of things, and it's important, the number of things that people do, the different ways of disposing of a body, are extremely relevant even now. I think if you open today's Washington Post, you can see how they're having major problems in India because of the burial of COVID victims. The traditional way in some cultures is to take the body, throw it into the Ganges River, and it goes down. And that was okay as long as A, you didn't have this huge population, and B, if it wasn't very, very contagious to do that. So that whole
not to mention contaminating. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. You don't want to drink that water anymore, man. And it is the big issue now in India is, how do you cope with that whole thing? Oh God, we have to do it this way. Grandma would want it, versus the idea that it'll kill everybody downstream.
Right. Or conversely, the practice of burning. Well, then if you've got a major catastrophe like we do right now, you've got not only the disposal issue of people who are not burning, a la the river, but you've got the disposal issue of, do we have enough firewood to dispose properly? And we'll just use grandma because that's handy, of grandma in the traditional manner, in the way in which she and our family would expect this to happen. And are we terrible people because we didn't do that?
There's a whole religious thing. Maybe you cannot get into heaven if you haven't been disposed of properly. That happens a lot.
Right.
And then there's this whole environmental impact because there's no more wood.
Right. And then there's the impact of, to put it grossly, nothing stinks worse than a human body, because we have a lot of chemicals in our system. A decaying deer smells pretty bad, but a decaying human smells 3 times worse, because we have all these chemicals in our bodies that are not found in nature. And so we stink really bad. So if you are burning that, not good. And also, then if you're burning things en masse, as some of the pictures in India have come out, you've got smoke pollution from that. You've got emissions pollution from that. And then you've got completely deforesting things to burn people, because it's not, in a lot of those cultures, it's not appropriate to use a crematorium. But either way, it's adding a lot of carbon footprint issues. And that right there, that whole scenario right there, put into a science fiction scenario, is also something that could be a brilliant story. How do you handle that carbon footprint versus traditional burial versus, and how does an alien culture handle that? How do you handle it as the author? How do you deal with it as the reader? Yeah.
The greatest book on that subject, the greatest novel about that, is Lois McMaster Bujold's Cryoburn. Have you read it? That is I actually reviewed that for the magazine, the International Cemetery Cremation and Funeral Association magazine, a trade publication. I had to review that novel because the entire plot turns around pre-planning your funeral. In the industry, pre-planning your funeral means you're like planning it in advance and like maybe even paying money to a cemetery or funeral home to say, let us say, buy a plot so that when you die, they're not running around in circles saying, well, what shall we do? What should we do with Monica?
And as a
she's
formal,
dead. And then
as a former funeral director, as person who worked in a funeral home, please do that if you haven't. But somebody just posted in the chat about Zoroastrian sky funerals have added solar panels to deal with the loss of indigenous vultures, because in Zoroastrian tradition, they have these towers and they place the bodies at the top and the vultures come and do their business. And then they move the bones down, you know, as the bodies do. And I forget, it was a mite or some sort of disease that went through the vulture population. So there are very few vultures. And so now they've done it with solar panels to like direct heat and do all that. And
so what do they just like sort of bake you down like
basically it's natural cremation. It's you know, it's intense heat, sunlight reducing the body in the same way cremation would, but a little bit slower than cremation would.
I don't know, man. I know
it's a little grim and gooey.
Well, you know, if you're here on this panel, you're sort of cool with the
grim and gooey.
So moving along, what are sorry, my dog has decided it's time to get some attention. What are some examples of funerary practices or the role of death in the real world that you find particularly fascinating, or in speculative fiction examples? You mentioned cryoburn, but I'm sure there are others that you guys have both read.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of fun with, because if you're going to write Victorian thrillers, people have to die. And then they have to have elaborate funerals and mourning and, you know, long black crepe veils that hang down to your knees. There's a whole history thing that you can suck on that is enormously useful and fun.
And if you really want to see where some of these Western practices started, it's in Victorian England. And there's this fabulous book by Judith Flanders called The Invention of Death.
Yes.
How the Victorians, let's see, it's the subtitle is How the Victorians Invented Crime, essentially the solving of crimes, but they invented a lot of our funerary practices too, because Victoria was mourning Albert and it became a whole thing. Plumes on the horses and mourning garb. Yeah, mourning garb like Brenda was talking about and all that. But the Judith Flanders book is brilliant. It's more about the crime solving part, but she does also touch on the fashion issues and things like that. It's really cool. Jennifer Povey put the burying people in cages to keep doctors from stealing their bits. That was actually in the late 1700s, early 1800s, because it was illegal to disturb a corpse. So if you were a doctor trying to do a anatomical study, you had to sort of sneak in the dark and steal corpses. And that's actually some of the stuff that's in Judith Flanders' book too. I went that way because it's sitting on my shelf over there.
There is a and that also gets you to the horror of funerals and cemeteries and dead bodies. You know, there's a reason why they celebrate Halloween. They have events in cemeteries. There's a reason why Dracula became a popular thing. It's the idea that he would mess with dead people, essentially. So there was a whole thing that's sort of tied to the industrialization of society. We don't usually see dead people anymore. There was a time, you know, in the 1600s, people died all the time because they died a lot. And, you know, people just sort of, you know, well, you know, auntie has died, you know, I guess we're going to have to do something with the body at some point. And it was more a regular part of life. And now we don't have that. We've completely sort of spun it off separately into a separate industry, separate places, and they're not part of our daily life. And whether that's good or bad, we can debate, but it's now what it is. And so, yeah, it is hard for people now to think about what they should do when they die. And if you have a plan about how you would like to go after you die, the very minimum, the rock bottom minimum you should do is to tell somebody, like, grab your son or your nephew or something and say, you know, Bill, what I would like is a Viking funeral. There's some people in California who will do this. Boat, fire, push out into the Pacific. That's what I want. You can do that, but you have to tell Bill about it. Otherwise, it's not happening.
And generally, you have to prepay it, because if you don't, Bill is just as likely to put you in a box. So,
well, Bill will make a lot more money after you leave him your inheritance. There's no way to compel Bill to do this. So if you really want to do it, set it up in advance, spend the money in advance so that there's a contract. And then Bill can just sort of slide into that after the bereavement of losing you by saying, well, you know, Auntie Monica set it all up and we're burning her in a boat in California. Let's go. And then it's
now,
easy.
just as a hint, that is still illegal in most places.
That's California is where they do it. The other thing you can do, did you know that I actually discovered they're still doing this? There's a bunch of people in California who will do you a complete Egyptian funeral. They will canopic jars for your organs. They'll mummify you, linen bands, small upcharge for your dog or cat. Think about it.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and that actually brings us back to the topic of funerary practices and the role of death in the real world, because one of the things that we all as a culture, especially here in Western society, seem to be utterly fascinated with is the funeral practices of the Egyptians.
Oh yeah.
And the Etruscans and those who, the painted faces on the caskets. And well, in that case, they're caskets, not coffins, because they don't have the shape. Coffin is an 8-sided Dracula box. We don't tend to bury people in that now. A casket is what we use generally now. And those should be metal or wood. And we generally use caskets, not coffins. But
are we going to decide? We're not going to discuss crypt liners now, right? We're not going to do do that.
Well, yeah,
it's a whole technical thing. There's a whole
we'll skip the technical stuff. So
if there's time later, if there's time towards
you
the
can
end.
Google on it. Google your friend crypt liner. Think about it.
Yes. But that to me is one of the ways in which we started being so fascinated with death and burial customs was in the 1800s when they started opening tombs in Egypt and stealing the relics. The Brits were bad for going in there and going, oh, look, a tomb, let's take shit home.
And previous to that point, there were so many mummies in Egypt that the local population would just do stuff, haul some out and use it for fertilizer. There's a pigment that the painters use called mummy, and it's a sort of grayish hue. Guess how they made it, why it's called mummy. There's just like stuff, there's just so much of it. It's just a resource, like wood ash.
Somebody posted in the chat about closed systems like spaceships, and one of the things that has just come online, and Brenda may know more about this than I do, is this group called Recompose, and they're doing turning you basically into mulch.
Right.
You decompose in a bed of mulch, and then they basically stir you up and let it decompose and mulch a little bit further, and then they spread you in a national forest.
There's an entire thing about green burial, the green burial movement, which you can Google on if you want, but you can find like organic cemeteries. There's like ways to have and if you cremate, the number of things you can do with your ashes is just about infinite. They can put you into reefs, they can bury you with trees, they can put you into outer space like Gene Roddenberry, they can pack you into fireworks. There's no limit.
They can
make you into jewelry.
Yes,
they can make you into jewelry.
I have seen a short story about a woman who, maybe it was even a movie about a woman whose husband died, and she did a life gem, where they put the ashes into a jewel. So she's wearing ex-hubby as diamond earrings while she's going out on dates with other men. And because it was a movie, the ghost of the deceased is floating around saying, "No, honey, can't you see he's a loser?" And she can't hear it.
Yeah, you can wear vials of your loved one's ashes. The bio-urn thing was so cool with the growing the trees.
Right.
But another great resource is a website called the Order of the Good Death. They have a great website with a huge repository of information on green options. So let's see, I'll put that in there.
I see here in the comments, someone mentions the story in the Sandman comics about it. Actually, I think it was a whole planet of undertakers, a city of undertakers. That's one of the things I was able to review for the magazine because I was the writer. They said, you can review stuff, can't you? And for a while I was reviewing recipe books about things to serve at after funeral meals. There's a whole Southern thing about what you serve after the meals, after the funeral, you know,
After the
potato
funeral,
salad, you know, macaroni salad. And that's the other thing you can pre-plan. If you don't want Aunt Louisa to make her awful potato salad, mention it in advance, you know.
Well, and there's a huge Southern tradition, and the funeral homes I worked in were all in the South. They were in North Carolina, and Georgia, and there's a huge Southern tradition of bringing Mama home to have the wake at the house, to have this, you know, and that tradition has died out a lot, but there is some indication that it may be coming back after lockdown. And that's a real challenge for funeral directors. Let me just tell you.
Well, it's nice to be able to do it like at the cemetery or at the church. And there's a trend now to build them with a social space to essentially accommodate that. And then from there, it's a very short slide to catering. You know, even if Aunt Louisa brings the despised potato salad, maybe you need a little more food than that, but no one else is organized enough to do it. So then the whole thing begins to snowball. But there is there's a surprising amount of literature about the field. I'm the one who forced them to review science fiction and Sandman comics, but there's a lot of literature about the whole issue that you can go into if you want to.
Okay, so then my next question for you guys, how can attitudes about death and dying shape stories unexpectedly? And I think you already you kind of already touched on how do they tell readers about societies that the writers are creating. But I think maybe diving a little bit more into how a writer could use death and dying and funerary practices to shape or to construct or deconstruct what's normal for the characters in their stories, especially on the spaceship, in a spaceship setting, or I think a lot of secondary world fantasy tends to go towards more historical practices. But when you're on a spaceship and you have the limited resources and what do people do with bodies? I know. Sorry, this is a quick aside, and then you can answer the question, or you can answer the questions first.
No, go ahead and make the quick aside.
So I wrote a short story called San Cibernetico, and it's a world ship and I somewhat based the religion on the ship in Andean burial practices, and the original crew from this world ship has been mummified, and they are now in a temple, and there are temple services where you get to go see the mummies of the original crew. And that was like, I was just thinking about like one way that the dead might be handled, or at least the more important dead could be handled when you're on a generation ship that's traveling for thousands of years.
Well, you saw that in Star Trek Discovery. They do that, where the fallen are actually in coffins or caskets on the outside of the ship, like in pods on the outside of the ship. The fallen are
but isn't there a problem with that? Because you only have so much biomass, bio stuff in a generation ship. If you pull out, you know, let us say every human being weighs 100, 150 pounds, even after they're dead, you're pulling 150 pounds out of molecules, protein, the system. And, you know, all right, so one or two that you can get away with. But if you're doing this over several generations and it's all in pods outside of the ship or in the temple or wherever it is, they're not rolling through in the biosystem of the ship. How long can you sustain that?
Well, and that's actually why I brought up the recompose, is because with recompose, bringing it back into the life cycle in terms of then your wood chips go into your your echo where your plants are, to feed the plants that feed the generation ship that feed, that has to be thought of. I mean, if you launch someone into space, as you say, Brenda, you've got to accommodate for the fact that, or if you keep them on the outside of the hull, for instance, like they do in the Star Trek, you have to accommodate fuel, resources, oxygen, because a decomposing body creates all sorts of gases. What are you going to do with those? You know, it is a closed environment. So how are you going to handle that?
And you
So-
would want to think about that while you were planning your generation ship. You wouldn't want to have to like do this on the fly, if you take what I mean.
No.
You're going to think all these thoughts well in advance, because it's going to be an issue, even if it's a relatively short generation ship, you know, 200-300 years. You still have to think about it, because after a certain, you just don't know what will happen, you know. It could, in fact, that would make a nice story in and of itself, where they planned it, but they didn't plan for that COVID or that, you know, astonishing mortality because of, I don't know, whatever.
Who knows? Yeah, whatever.
And suddenly it's an issue, a real issue, and you're going to have to change the plan on the fly, because otherwise, frankly, you're going to lose so much mass that the system's not going to keep going. You know, the I think you've seen it. They're imitating the burial at sea, where you shoot the body out into outer space. You know, goodbye, Captain. You know.
Yeah.
But you can't do that forever.
Then you've got to deal with the fact that your ship weight is different than you calculated for. Or, you know, there was one, there's a story by Laura Lamb, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's about basically a Mars colonial mission, but it's not Mars, it's another satellite. And someone slips on board as a stowaway, and it causes the ship complete imbalance, because everything was calculated for this number of crew members breathing this much oxygen, eating this much food, and how do we manage that?
It's a more complex cold equation story then.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But so then you also have to accommodate, as we've already said, what if somebody dies? Or what if you have many somebody's dying? How do you,
you know, when they're doing the short-term things, when they're talking like going to Mars or having even on the International Space Station, they don't worry about that because it's so short. If any longer, even like a long Mars mission, if it takes 2-3 years to get to Mars, that's a long enough time where you could develop an issue and die.
Right. Well, and also too, you've got the things that you see in some books and shows, like the Dune movies and the Dune books. They compress the dead and suck out all the water, refine it, reuse it, and then the rest is composted. Well, you know, we're, what is it, 78% water, so there's not going to be that much mass left. But there's a lot of ways you could go with it.
I'm going to dive into a couple of questions that are coming in through the Q&A, because I think some of them will prompt some good discussion. So segueing a little bit into the adapting, because you guys were talking about adapting, like the ship at sea burial. One person in the audience has asked, how do current funerary practices and beliefs how would you adapt them to the environment where you have that closed body disposal situation? Like,
I have read novels where they just put the deceased into the composting system of the generation ship, you know, and it's a funeral and it's everything, but then grandma goes into the tank and is gradually processed back, all her molecules moving. And when you think about it, that is essentially what is happening now in the world. It's just sort of bigger than you would see it, but every molecule that you eat or breathe possibly was eaten or breathed or was a part of, I don't know, Grandma. Alexander the Great, let us say. Well, not grandma, because the time frame isn't long enough, but Alexander the Great, there's a good one, you know. The dust of Alexander may stop a bunghole. Remember that?
Yeah. Well, I think that we as humans are always going to adapt funerary practices. We have not, even in the 20th century, grown beyond wanting some sort of ceremony, some sort of acknowledgement, some sort of marker, we are markers. We want to make sure that someone's name is, if nothing else, their name and lineage is remembered. And so I think that even if we end up with generation ships, for instance, we're going to have funerals and we're going to have remembrances. And, you know, here we are 2 decades past 9/11, and we're still memorializing that. The Vietnam War has a memorial. You know, we're just a culture all over the globe, no matter what the culture is, that we memorialize.
And that changes too over time. You've seen I'm sure you've seen the concept of the digital tombstone. You walk past the tombstone and you hold your cell phone up to that chip, and then it downloads a whole video about the deceased, which the family has very kindly set on the tomb for you to do that with. I don't know how that'll hold up. But the other thing that happens nowadays is that the notion of taking like your pets with you, pet funerals didn't used to be a thing, but in our lifetime, they have become a thing. And now, you're going to take your doggy with you. If doggy passes before you do, can I set it up so that when I go, I will have Fluff and Spot with me? Yes, you can.
Absolutely, you can. And, I saw somebody earlier, very early in the chat, posting about, somebody being buried with someone else's ashes in their crook of their arm. And that's very common. That's very common.
Yeah.
But I think too, but no matter where we advance to, whether that's Mars or consistently out in space, we will have funerals, we will have memorials. And as somebody said, if nothing else, there'll be a memorial wall on the ship.
Or even like a memorial chip or a memorial QR code or something. There is that's sort of, I think, is part of human nature. And it would be interesting to, do the thing where you visit a planet where they don't really particularly care. Grandma drops dead. Well, we'll push her to one side and then let's go and have lunch.
Right. I want to address something that's going on in the chat right now. Embalming actually started in the 1770s. It did not come into vogue. It started to be a little more popular during the Civil War, as somebody said, but it still was not a thing into the 20th century. It was late 40s when bringing soldiers and generals more than anything else home from World War II before it became really more of a thing. And it wasn't until the 60s and the 70s that it really became the thing. And that became for health reasons, actually.
And embalming is a sort of a different thing than actually burying people. You can just bury people, pop them into a coffin and away you go. And the whole concept of embalming them is fairly modern, and you need modern chemicals to do it. But it's and it's not that environmentally friendly either. But it is
in any iteration. The 1770s, it was arsenic and lead, and now it's lots of chemicals. And so at no point is embalming environmentally friendly.
No. But it is the sort of thing that I think that will possibly go back out of fashion simply because it's not really necessary. If you're going to bury somebody right away, what's the point? I can see it if you were shipping them back from Normandy, then sure, then it might be a good idea. Right. But if you're not going to be doing that kind of a thing, there's cheaper and more friendly, more environmentally friendly ways to do this. Oh, and that's another
SB posted in the chat that yes, embalming has been used in ancient cultures, but in terms of widespread use, not until the 1960s or 70s. Only in ancient cultures, embalming was only used in the very wealthy. It was not, the commonplace man.
No, they would do like cats and dogs and alligators and stuff in ancient Egypt. But ancient Egypt is kind of interesting because that's a place where you can naturally embalm people. You just get that body, you dig a hole in the sand, pile it on. 1 year later, they're a raisin. And you don't have to do anything because of the heat and the low humidity. But that's not usually, I'm certain you could not do this in Baltimore, Maryland.
That's something that you could do on other planets. Like
you could imagine this.
You
could imagine this, but why would you wish to do it? No.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to build
when you've got them stacked 20 deep, you're at some point you got to go, let's not do this anymore. But it's interesting to me to think that, yes, embalming in Egypt was a very common, complex process, but preservation wasn't. Now, the problem we have, though, in modern culture is we've gone way off the scale with this whole preservation thing. Embalming preserves a body for potentially 300-400 years in ideal conditions. In 99.9% of American states and protectorates, you have to have 2 containers. You have a two container law for health reasons. You have to have a casket and you have to have a vault. And that and embalming, and the fact that funeral or cemeteries tend to be up on hills and not in low swampy places, you end up preserving bodies for centuries. Well, why? Right? So we're kind of coming back to, as Brenda said, the green movement, where people are going, really? But for health reasons, you cannot not embalm a body if you're not going to bury within 24 to 72 hours, depending on your jurisdiction. So,
and that's why cremation is actually so relatively good, because then a lot of the expenses drop out, and you can do things like, say, carry the deceased ashes back to your native country and bury them with the ancestors back in China or Jerusalem or wherever it is you want to do it. To ship a real body, you better embalm, because they're not putting it onto the airplane unless it is embalmed, and that it adds up pretty fast. That's a heavy weight to drag. You can carry a urn of ashes in your hand luggage in the suitcase.
And most airlines have an actual locking cabinet, like just like they have for like the carts that lock in place. Then 90% of them have lock-in cabinets in a plane that for no charge they will put the ashes in, so nobody disturbs it in the overhead luggage or gets freaked out by it.
Just in case there's an airplane, a rough ride on the airplane, it doesn't fall out,
Which would really
the overhead compartment contents may shift. You don't want to do that.
Or on a ship, that could be a problem on a ship too.
So there's a lot to be said for not going the full whack, and you won't hear that from funeral directors, because they have a whole vested interest in having you go the full whack, but you don't have to do that.
Right. So, and I think more and more people are understanding that.
Yes.
Given our current circumstances. But anyway, I'm sorry, Monica.
No, it's okay. We're getting close to the last 15 minutes, or we're in the last 15 minutes for the panel. So I wanted to pull in another question or two from the Q&A. There is one in here where the audience member asked, what sort of funerary practices might there be when aging and disease have been conquered and death is not that common, and it's more often a misadventure for otherwise immortals?
I think they're going to be even more elaborate, because the less frequent they are, the more elaborate and more shocking it's going to be for the culture if it becomes to where we're not so used to it. I mean, we've sort of gotten there now, in the sense that we are very much at arm's length from death. Unless you're Jewish, especially some of the more conservative sects, or Muslim, people don't see their dead loved ones. They die in the hospital at arm's length.
And then they're immediately shuffled over to the funeral home and dealt with there. They don't die at home. People don't die at home anymore.
Not generally.
Well, unless there's just some horrible thing, gunfire.
Right, or they're in hospice care or something like that. But for the most part, a lot of our people die outside of the home. And even if we're present when they pass, we don't take care of the bodies ourselves. 90% of the time. Now, there are people who do, and there are cultures who still do this. But for the average American, we don't go and wash the body and prepare the body and do all those sorts of things. So we have a distance from it. And I think that if you have an essentially immortal culture where disease has been eradicated and you die out after a much longer period, the celebration or acknowledgement of your passing is probably going to be much bigger deal. What do you think, Brenda?
I can't imagine that actually being an issue, because unless you don't have a large population, there's always going to be some people dying. And the other larger, frankly, if you have a large immortal population, you're going to have bigger issues to deal with than funerals. Where are you going to put all these people? That's not where the action would be, because there's going to be just major other issues for you to have fun with. But if you, assuming that you didn't have such a huge number of people, then yeah, whenever anybody dies, it would be a major thing. And you could imagine that it would be become like weddings, where you have a big blowout, and we go to Italy and we have to all sit on an island in Capri and drink Prosecco, that kind of a wedding. Or you could have that kind of a funeral if you really wanted to do that, Yeah, they could send you off by, well, didn't Gene Roddenberry get scattered in outer space from the International Space Station at one point? So see, that kind of a thing. You could do that.
Okay, so the next question that I wanted to flag was talking about emotion in death and funerary practices. One audience member wanted to know, when did emotion become so tied into how death and how we have our funerary practices, and how can that be used in world building?
I think that when death was much more common, I think it's a mistake to think about far past that people were blasé about death. You hear about people before they had child inoculations, you could lose, every other baby you had. So, you have 10 kids so that 5 will live. And but it's a mistake to say that that mother and father did not grieve every single one of those infants. They are as we were, they felt it, and that they had to face it every other year was a tragedy, and rather than that they were just sort of hardened to it. One of the things that the Victorian practices were supposed to do was to give you a way to express your anguish. You wore black so that everyone around would know, oh, we mustn't talk to Monica harshly now. She's really in grief. And you would decorate your house for the funeral. You would turn your mirrors to the wall and put crepe over the fireplace or the front door knocker.
I honestly wish we still did some of that, because especially
it would be
with
a
COVID,
good thing.
It would be a good thing. I lost 2 siblings in January, one in January, one in February, and I would really have loved a mourning band, so that people would know. People would know.
Or some kind of thing, because so much of our lives now are virtual, that there'd be some, I don't know, a black bow on your Zoom icon or something. But there, just the idea that someone that you could express that I'm really not in a good place right now, and go easy on me. And so there sort of is some things like that online. If you're in the science fiction, they'll put a rose up for you on the SFF.net page on Facebook, that kind of thing. But and I think right here at Balticon, they had a memorial service for Don Sakers, who passed away so suddenly. And, so we do stuff, but it has to be appropriate to our time and our place. I'm not sure that in lockdown conditions, having a black armband would really be helpful. No one would see it.
So building off of that, how do you think, what are some examples that you've seen mourning markings in science fiction or speculative fiction, like the stuff that you've read? Have you seen that at all? Like examples that are not like just, I don't know.
I've seen it in older science fiction. I haven't seen it in anything I've read recently as something that people like armbands or an acknowledgement of that way. I read a short story using some of the Jewish traditions of sitting Shiva, but they didn't really go into detail, because what they were focusing on was the covering the mirrors, and that was sort of the key part of the story. But one of the reasons I started teaching the body disposal for writers class was that I read 3 or 4 books in a row where they got it really wrong. Now, any of you out there who are writers, your funeral home, your local funeral home, they would love to talk to you about this. Please talk to them if you're writing a death scene or a funeral scene, even if it's just to say, hey, let me buy you a cup of coffee and run this scene by you, because getting it wrong really sucks. Like, you can't bury somebody in Maine in February. There's not a backhoe maid that can dig a grave in Maine in February.
Dynamite.
Short of dynamite. I read a story. I picked up this book, sounded really good. I started reading it. And the opening scene is people digging a grave by hand and lowering a coffin, 8-sided Dracula box, into a grave by hand. And I'm thinking, I didn't think this was an historical. So I flipped back to the beginning and I started over, and I'm like, this is not an historical. They've got a truck, an F-150. So she's driving up to the funeral. I'm like, nobody digs a grave by hand.
Backhoe. And frankly, with backhoe, you can break through the permafrost.
Yes. Now you can, but it's really expensive and takes a lot of gas. So they just usually wait. But and they have warming blankets. There are ways to do it, but it's in general too expensive for most people. But one of the things that I just tell people is call your funeral director. They can tell you, or the Good Death site or some of these others. They can tell you. Please don't do it in a
and
coffin
you
by
can
hand.
visit cemeteries. You can visit cemeteries.
Oh,
You can
sure.
do tours. You know, they're
Not
perfectly.
they're not
Yeah.
so busy that they won't talk to you.
Yeah, and there is and particularly burials, you could just sort of ooze on over to the back and stand at the back, and they'll assume that you're the deceased's mistress, or something.
Yeah.
As long as you're not weird, and you just stand there
Yeah.
quietly. It's like church services. You can go.
Yeah.
And as long as you're not weird, people will be okay.
And I'm
with
going
it.
to add the last plea of please, if you're going to do a military funeral, please go on the Arlington website and walk through the funeral practices. Do not write that until you have done so.
Yeah.
Don't make it up. Don't make it up.
So we are on our last 3 minutes. So if you have any very last thoughts or takeaways you want people to come with, go away with, and then also where people can find you. I know we put the links in the chat, but just a reminder in case that's too far buried for some people listening at this point.
Brenda, we don't go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think that a lot of this stuff is not new, and you can find it online. There's a Jewish Funeral Directors Association, a Jewish Cemeteries Association, whatever ethnicity, whatever group, whatever religious practice, there's somebody who knows exactly how to bury them. And, even in the United States, if you're a Jain or a Baha'i or something, there's somebody who knows. Google, your friend. You can kick all this stuff up. Don't make it up. If you're going to actually work within a real thing, then you don't have to make it up. If you were going to make it up, then
set it in space.
Yeah, then have fun. Okay, have fun. But create a new religion, and it has a really cool new funeral practice. You can do that. But if you're going to do a real thing, a real military funeral or stuff, look it up, baby. What else?
Where can we find you?
Oh, okay. I have a web page. Oh, and also if you throw my name into Google, I'm the first 300 hits that come up. Easy. And my web page is brendaclough.net. And you can find a lot of my e-novels on Bookview Cafe, including a free one. So you could go over there. And the one thing you can say about writing Victorian novels is there's a lot of fun funeral stuff you could do.
Well, I'm Jeanne Adams. You can find me at jeanneadams.com. I spend way too much time on Twitter at Jeanne Adams. And as I said, I teach a class on body disposal for writers. I'm doing one for Maryland Writers Association in a couple weeks. If anybody wants to know about that, just hit me up on Water Table and I'll let you know how to get a part of that. I also, in my newsletter, which you can sign up on my website, post when I'm going to be teaching that class.
Nice. Thank you. And I'm Monica Louzon. I'm acquiring editor at The Dread Machine. And you can find me on Twitter at Molo_writes. And I will be hanging around in the Water Table channel for a little bit if you've got questions for me after this panel. And I wanted to say thank you to everyone who sent in questions that we weren't able to get to. Please feel free to throw them into the Discord. And then also thank you to the panelists and the audience for being awesome tonight. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. Brenda, we have to have a cup of coffee and talk.
Oh, we do. I'm on Facebook. I don't know if you're on Facebook. You can come over and we can do professional stuff.
Talk about dead things.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's our time. Thank you, everybody, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Monica. Thank you, Carolyn.